So in this video, I have a pretty crazy story for you. It involves Adolf Hitler, an ex-Irish Catholic priest, a secret anti-Nazi underground organisation dubbed the Red Orchestra, and the translation of one of the most notorious books of the 20th century, that's Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, into English. It all revolves around the Irishman James Vincent Murphy, and we're going to explore how he became the first person to fully translate Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. It came out in 1939, just a couple of months before the Second World War began. It was a pretty explosive book, and as I said already, we've got an anti-Nazi underground organisation into the mix as well, so this is a really intriguing story. But let's begin with the man who this story revolves around, and that's James Vincent Murphy. So the key person in this story is James Vincent Murphy. He was born just outside the West Cork town of Bandon in the year 1880. His background was pretty normal in terms of a 19th century Irish upbringing. His family were Catholic farmers, they weren't that poor. His background, or his early life though, was pretty normal. Now his father did die in 1894 when James was just 14, and this seems to have haunted him for the rest of his life because he felt he was responsible. Long story short, his father fell off a horse, but James had attached the saddle and he felt he didn't do it correctly. But after his father's death, the family certainly weren't plunged into poverty or anything like that. His mother, Hannah, continued to work the family farm, and in the early 20th century, James, who showed academic promise, went to study to become a priest, and he was ordained in 1905 after a very successful academic career in seminaries in Ireland. Now this would start a journey that would see him travel around the world, so let's look at that next. So after being ordained a priest in 1905, he would teach in a seminary in Ireland for a year, and then he did what was, I suppose, the most Irish thing someone could do in the early 20th century, and that was emigrate. So he went to the United States, where he worked in Wisconsin in a seminary there teaching. However, while he was a really good academic, James Murphy was not a good priest, and he actually got fired after just 1 year in Wisconsin. He left there and went to Rhode Island, where he worked in the diocese there, but he was fired after a couple of years, and this would see him return to Europe. And increasingly, James Murphy realised that the priesthood wasn't for him. But his mother, Hannah, who was still alive in Ireland, she seems to have been really keen that her son James would become a priest. And while she was alive, he wouldn't leave the priesthood. However, during the First World War, he drifted increasingly from the church. He worked for the Italian government in an information bureau that they were running in London during the First World War. He did occasionally say masses for the Diocese of Westminster. But at the end of the war in 1918, his mother Hannah finally died. And after this, James Murphy left the priesthood. He stopped using the term or the title of Father Murphy. He would go by the term Dr. Murphy from then on. He would actually even go on to marry, and he left his Catholic background, I suppose, and pursued a new career in journalism and research. He had a particular interest in the fascist dictatorships that emerged in the 1920s. So let's look at that, because that's what leads him to translate Mein Kampf and get him entangled with communist spies in Germany. So the 1920s and 1930s is known in history for the rise of fascism, first in Italy in the early 20s, and then the Nazis emerged in Germany in the 1930s. And James Murphy was actually on the ground in both countries as this happened. He was in Italy in the early 1920s when Mussolini took power, and he wrote a series of essays and books about this and his observations on the emergence of fascism. I think it's fair to say Murphy himself probably wasn't a fascist. He was deeply conservative, and as we'll see in a minute, in the 1930s when he moved to Nazi Germany, he would espouse some pretty dark views about German fascism. So let's look at that next. So by the late 1920s, James Murphy had left Italy, he had moved back to Britain, and from there he moved to Germany in 1929 and was on the ground in Germany for the rise of the Nazis. They really emerged from being a small, pretty obscure party in 1928 to being a massive party in Germany in 1930. And James Murphy was on the ground to watch this happening. Now, he would leave Germany in 1932 before Hitler seized power the following year of 1933. But back in Britain, as Hitler emerged as a major figure in European politics, James Murphy, who had all this experience of living in Germany, decided that he would write a book about Adolf Hitler. So in 1934, he published this book called Adolf Hitler. I think it's called The Drama of His Career. And the book hasn't aged well, let's put it that way. He takes a pretty sympathetic view of German fascism. He repeats anti-Semitic propaganda of the Nazis and doesn't challenge it. And he also repeats tropes about the Jewish people in this book. And it was criticised pretty roundly in Britain when it came out. However, and this wasn't a great sign for James Murphy, the one group of people who were happy with the book were the Nazis, and they actually went as far as to offer James Murphy a job in Nazi Germany. If he would move over, they would give him work translating Hitler's and other leading Nazis' speeches. So James Murphy, who was always not great with money, decided he would take this opportunity, and he moved to Germany in 1934, I think it was, or maybe 1935. But anyway, in Germany, he spots an opening as a translator. He criticizes all the previous English translators the Nazis had used and said that he was much better. And actually, he offered then to translate Hitler's autobiography / political tract from the 1920s. It's called Mein Kampf, pretty notorious book. But Murphy offered to translate this into an English version. And believe it or not, all through the 1930s, there was actually no full English language version of this book, Mein Kampf. There's an abridged or edited down version available where the Nazis had removed some of the more controversial passages in an edition published in the English language, but there was no full English edition. So James Murphy set about writing or translating this in the 1930s. And around 1938, he starts getting going on this, and he's helped by a German woman called Greta Lorca. We'll come back to her in a minute. But before he could finish the book, he ends up falling foul of the Nazis because he doesn't want to translate speeches that are critical of the British leadership. The Nazis basically don't trust him anymore, so they sack him from the propaganda ministry where he was working. And from there, they actually seize his translation of Mein Kampf because they don't trust him anymore. And Murphy eventually has to flee Nazi Germany and moves back to Britain in the later months of 1938. Now, this is where the story really gets interesting, and I'm going to cover that next. So back in Britain in the late 1930s, James Vincent Murphy is now down in his luck. He has no job, he has no money, but he does have this translation of Adolf Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. And don't forget, the world is hurtling towards World War II, so Hitler is a big name. People are interested in what he had to say in this book, Mein Kampf, but there's, as I've said, no full version of it in the English language available. So James Murphy has one problem though. If he can get the book, he can publish it and make a lot of money, he thinks. He finds a publisher in England that will publish it, but there's one problem. He doesn't have a copy of the book. They're all in Germany. Now, in a part of the story that doesn't look that well for James Murphy, he won't go back to Germany because he's afraid of what the Nazis will do, but he sends his wife Mary. She travels over, tracks down a handwritten translation that a secretary had made, and she brings this back to England. And the book is actually published in March 1939. This is just 6 months before the start of the First World War. The translation is, I suppose you could say, controversial. James Murphy puts an introduction of sorts to the book, and it's pretty sympathetic to the Nazis. This doesn't age well either. He doesn't look pretty good from this introduction. He talks about how some of the more controversial sections, shall we call it, of Mein Kampf shouldn't be listened to too much, and that Hitler had written these in the 1920s and his views had changed. History would prove they hadn't changed at all. And the book was published. Now, this book would go on to sell 200,000 copies, but James Murphy would see hardly any of this money. He only got £400 because his publisher would claim that the Nazis hadn't given over the copyright, so they wouldn't pay Murphy in case the Nazis came looking for royalties. Now, there's a fascinating backstory to all this though, because at the start I mentioned an anti-Nazi underground organisation, sometimes referred to as the Red Orchestra. And unbeknownst to James Murphy, a lot of his work had secretly been influenced by this organisation known as the Red Orchestra. So next, I want to explain that part of the story to you. So in the 1930s, a German woman, Greta Lorca, helped James Murphy translate Mein Kampf. And James Murphy just thought that she was a brilliant scholar and translator and was really happy to work with her. Unbeknownst to James Murphy, Greta Lorca was actually a secret Nazi resistor in Germany. She was educated in several different European countries. She was from Germany. Frankfurt was where she was born, but she was educated in several different European countries and in the US. Returns to Germany just before the Nazis take power and then gets involved in resistance activities. She goes on to join the German Communist Party. And then at the same time, she's working for Murphy. And when he says that he's going to translate Mein Kampf, Greta Lorca is unsure of what she thinks about this, because she's on the one hand going she doesn't want to share Hitler's views, but on the other hand, she starts to realise there's an advantage to this, because there's no full English language edition of Mein Kampf available in the English language. And she feels that if she can get Hitler's views out there, people might take the threat he posed more seriously. So Greta Lorca actually helps James Murphy, but at the same time, she manages to slightly change it. So Murphy, as we've seen, I suppose you could describe him as somewhat sympathetic to Hitler, and he kind of smoothed out some of the more controversial sections. But at the same time, he had a big drink problem, and he increasingly left a lot of the work up to Greta Lorca, and she actually reworded some of his passages to bring out some of the darker aspects of Hitler's work in Mein Kampf and bring that to the world. So I guess if there's a hero of this story, it's that woman, Greta Lorca. Actually, in a dark end to the story, she and the fellow resistors, they were part of an organisation that the Nazis would call the Red Orchestra. They were uncovered in 1942. Greta's husband, Adam, was executed by the Nazis, and she would spend the rest of the war in prison, and she was liberated by the Red Army in 1945. And then James Murphy, what happened to him? Well, he would survive the war. He commented on the Nazis in the British press at various points during the war, but he died in 1946 after a period of ill health. So that's the story of the Irishman who translated Mein Kampf. If you want to hear more videos on Irish history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell where you'll get notifications when new videos come out.